On September 3, 1983, at approximately 11:42 p.m., Barbara Henley noticed something in a patient's medical chart that would unravel a Soviet intelligence operation running through the cardiac care unit of Georgetown University Hospital. She was 31 years old, 9 years into a nursing career that had been defined by meticulous attention to detail and an almost obsessive commitment to accurate documentation. The hospital sat in Northwest Washington, a sprawling medical complex that served a steady flow of government employees, diplomatic personnel, and contractors who worked in the agencies and offices scattered throughout the capital. Barbara's shift that night, her third consecutive on the cardiac care unit, had been routine until she sat down at the nurse's station just before midnight to review patient charts and prepare notes for the incoming morning staff. The patient was Viktor Petrov, a 58-year-old man who had been admitted on August 29th with chest pain and cardiac arrhythmia. His intake forms listed his occupation as retired translator, his address as an apartment in DuPont Circle, and his emergency contact as a nephew in Baltimore. He'd been stable since admission, responding well to medication, and was expected to be discharged within the week. Barbara had cared for him on 2 previous shifts and found him pleasant, if somewhat reserved, the kind of patient who thanked nurses politely but didn't initiate much conversation beyond what was medically necessary. She was reviewing his self-reported medical history forms, the detailed questionnaires patients fill out regarding previous conditions, medications, and allergies, when she noticed the notations. They appeared in the margins of the 3rd page, small clusters of letters and numbers written in blue ink, K7, M3, R9, followed by what looked like X2, B4, L1. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, and the notations bore no resemblance to anything Barbara had seen in 9 years of reading patient charts. She paused, pen hovering above her own notepad, and studied the marks more carefully. They weren't medical abbreviations. She knew the standard shorthand, the codes doctors used for common conditions and treatments, and these patterns didn't match any of them. Her first assumption was that they were notes Petrov had written for his own records, perhaps reminders about medications or symptoms he wanted to discuss with his regular physician. But the positioning was odd. The notations sat in margins that most patients left blank, tucked beside questions about surgical history and family medical background, places where someone taking personal notes would have no reason to write. Barbara flipped back through earlier pages of the chart. On the first page, in a different margin, another sequence, D8, P2, V6. She felt something shift in her chest, a small tightening that had nothing to do with the late hour or the fatigue that usually set in around midnight. These weren't random. They followed a pattern. Barbara's father had been a codebreaker during World War II, working at Arlington Hall on Japanese diplomatic communications, and she had grown up hearing stories about pattern recognition and cipher systems. She'd taken a cryptography course in college, more out of curiosity about her father's work than any serious academic interest, but she'd retained enough to recognize that what she was looking at bore the hallmarks of a substitution cipher. Letter number combinations, consistent formatting, deliberate placement. She sat back in her chair, the fluorescent lights of the nurse's station humming above her, and tried to construct an innocent explanation. Maybe Petrov used some personal notation system. Maybe these were references to something in his native language. Maybe she was seeing patterns where none existed, exhausted from too many consecutive shifts and too little sleep. But on September 8th, when Petrov filled out a dietary restrictions update form and Barbara noticed new notations in the margins, identical in format but different in content, she knew she wasn't imagining it. Barbara began documenting everything on September 16th. using a small spiral notebook she kept in her locker, separate from any hospital materials. She recorded the date and time of each observation, copied the letter number sequences exactly as they appeared, and noted the circumstances under which Petrov added them to his charts. The documentation was methodical, almost clinical. The same precision she applied to patient care now turned toward something she couldn't yet fully articulate. She told herself she was gathering information before deciding whether to report anything, that premature accusations could destroy an innocent man's privacy and her own credibility. But the truth was, she'd already made the decision to investigate. The only question was how far she would go. Over the next 3 weeks, a pattern emerged. New notations appeared in Petrov's charts every 3 to 4 days, always in margins, always following the same letter number format. On September 19th, T5N8Q3. On September 23rd, H1C7M9. Barbara began volunteering for extra shifts on the cardiac care unit, telling the scheduling coordinator she needed additional hours to cover car repairs, which wasn't entirely untrue. Her Honda had been making concerning noises for weeks, but the real reason was access. She needed to be present when Petrov was active, when he was filling out forms or updating information, and the only way to ensure that was to be there as often as possible. She started noticing other things. Petrov received visitors, but not many. Most cardiac patients had family members who came daily, sitting beside beds and asking doctors repetitive questions about recovery timelines. Petrov's visitors were infrequent and brief. On September 28th, Barbara observed a woman entering his room at 2:17 in the afternoon. She was approximately 45 years old, wearing a dark coat despite the mild weather, and carrying a magazine. Barbara checked the visitor log at the nurse's station after the woman left 23 minutes later. There was no entry. Hospital policy required all visitors to sign in, providing names and relationship to the patient. But this woman had bypassed the desk entirely, or had been waved through by someone who hadn't followed protocol. The same woman returned on October 5th, again on a Wednesday, again between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. This time, Barbara positioned herself at the nurse's station where she had a clear view of Petrov's room. The woman entered, stayed exactly 11 minutes, and left. She never stopped at the desk. Barbara didn't approach Petrov about the visits. To ask would reveal she'd been watching, and she couldn't afford to make him suspicious if her growing concerns had any basis in reality. On October 3rd, she walked into Petrov's room to check his vital signs and found him photographing his medical charts with a small camera. He looked up, smiled pleasantly, and explained that he wanted copies for his regular doctor back home, that the hospital had approved it. Barbara confirmed later that afternoon that patients were indeed allowed to photograph their own records, but the interaction stayed with her. She'd seen the angle of his camera, the way he'd positioned the pages. He wasn't photographing the medical information, the doctor's notes about his cardiac rhythms or medication dosages. He was photographing the margins where his notations appeared. Barbara stopped sleeping well. She'd lie awake in her apartment in Arlington, watching headlights move across her ceiling, running through possibilities. On October 9th, she canceled plans with friends, claiming she was coming down with something. On October 11th, a colleague asked if everything was okay, noting that Barbara seemed distracted. Barbara forced a smile and blamed it on fatigue from the extra shifts, which was partially true. The exhaustion was real, but it came less from the hours than from carrying a suspicion she couldn't share with anyone. On October 12th, everything crystallized. The mystery woman arrived at 2:34 in the afternoon, and Barbara watched from the hallway as she entered Petrov's room. 15 minutes later, the woman left, and Barbara waited exactly 2 minutes before finding a reason to enter the room herself. Petrov was writing in the margins of a form, his hand moving with the same mechanical precision she'd noted before. He'd just received information, and he was encoding it immediately while it was fresh. Barbara called the FBI Washington field office on October 13th at 9:47 in the morning from a payphone 3 blocks from her apartment. She'd considered calling from home but decided against it, operating on an instinct for caution she didn't fully understand. The agent who answered sounded young and skeptical when Barbara explained she was a nurse at Georgetown Hospital and had observed what she believed might be coded messages in a patient's medical records. There was a pause on the line, the kind of silence that suggested the agent was deciding whether this was a legitimate concern or a waste of time. Barbara pressed forward, mentioning her father's work during World War II and her own background in cryptography, however limited. The agent's tone shifted slightly. He took her name and number and said someone from the Counterintelligence Division would contact her within 48 hours. The call came the next day. Special Agent Michael Chen introduced himself and asked if Barbara could meet him at the FBI office on October 15th at 2:00 in the afternoon. She arranged to take a personal day from the hospital, telling her supervisor she had a dental appointment, and spent the intervening hours second-guessing everything. What if she was wrong? What if the notations were innocent, and she was about to accuse a sick man of espionage based on nothing more than her own paranoia and a college course she'd barely passed? The FBI office was located in a building that looked like any other government facility in Washington. Concrete and glass and American flags hanging motionless in the October air. Chen met her in a conference room on the 4th floor. He was in his mid-30s, wearing a dark suit and a blue tie, and he had the kind of face that revealed nothing about what he was thinking. Barbara spread her documentation across the table. Photocopies of the chart pages with Petrov's notations, her spiral notebook with dates and observations, a timeline she'd constructed showing when the mystery woman visited and when new codes appeared. Chen studied the materials for several minutes without speaking. Then he looked up and told Barbara that the FBI had been monitoring Soviet intelligence activities at several Washington hospitals for the past 18 months. Medical facilities were useful for intelligence work, he explained, because they provided legitimate reasons for people to meet, to exchange materials, to have conversations in semi-private spaces where surveillance was difficult. The fact that Barbara had noticed these notations and had the presence of mind to document them was significant. He asked her permission to have the materials analyzed by FBI cryptographers and to run a background check on her, which he explained was standard procedure when working with civilian sources. The background check came back clean within 3 days. No foreign contacts, no financial problems, no criminal record. Exemplary employment history at Georgetown. Chen called Barbara on October 19th and asked her to continue working her normal shifts, to maintain her usual interactions with Petrov, and to document any new observations. He stressed that she should not change her behavior in any way that might alert Petrov or his contacts that he was under suspicion. Barbara agreed, though the request filled her with a dread she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just an observer. She was now part of an active investigation. The FBI's cryptographers confirmed what Barbara had suspected. The notations followed a substitution cipher pattern, likely a modified book code that required a key text to decode fully. The level of structure suggested professional training, not something an amateur would construct. The question now was what information Petrov was encoding and passing through his visitor. Background investigation into Viktor Petrov revealed he'd immigrated to the United States in 1979, worked as a freelance translator, and had contracts with several companies that did business with government agencies. Nothing classified, but access to documents and conversations that could be useful to a foreign intelligence service looking to understand American defense procurement or policy discussions. The mystery woman was identified through surveillance photographs Barbara helped FBI agents capture during the next visit. Her name was Marina Sokolova, and she worked as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy, a position that frequently served as cover for KGB officers operating under diplomatic protection. Barbara's life split into two versions. At the hospital, she was the same professional nurse she'd always been, checking vital signs and administering medications and chatting with patients about their families. But underneath that routine was a constant awareness that she was being watched by the FBI, and that she was watching Petrov, and that everything she observed might matter in ways she couldn't predict. She told no one, not her friends, not her colleagues, not even her mother during their weekly phone calls. The isolation was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with the extra shifts. On October 27th, Chen informed Barbara that Petrov was scheduled to be discharged on November 8th. The FBI wanted to allow the discharge to proceed normally, then maintain surveillance outside the hospital where they had more operational flexibility. Barbara's role would end once Petrov left Georgetown, but Chen asked her to document any unusual activity in the final 2 weeks. Barbara nodded, relieved and somehow disappointed at the same time, as if she'd been preparing for something that was now being taken away from her before she understood what it meant. The FBI's plan was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. They would allow Petrov to be discharged as scheduled, maintain surveillance on his apartment and known meeting locations, and wait for him to make contact with Sokolova outside the protected environment of the hospital. Chen explained this to Barbara on October 28th during a brief meeting in a coffee shop 6 blocks from Georgetown. The goal was to catch both of them in an active exchange of classified materials, something that would provide clear evidence for prosecution. Barbara's final task was to document any new notations that appeared before discharge and to observe whether Petrov's behavior changed in ways that might suggest he knew he was being watched. But on November 1st, something shifted in Barbara's understanding of the situation. She was reviewing Petrov's latest test results with the attending cardiologist when the doctor mentioned that Petrov's condition was more serious than initially assessed. The arrhythmia had responded to medication, but there were underlying issues that would require ongoing monitoring and possible surgical intervention within the next 6 months. Petrov would need regular follow-up appointments, lifestyle modifications, and careful management of his prescriptions. The doctor spoke about these matters with the clinical detachment that came from delivering difficult news multiple times a day, but Barbara felt something tighten in her chest. Petrov wasn't just a suspected spy. He was genuinely ill, and the care she'd provided over the past 2 months had been real medical treatment for a real cardiac condition. She thought about the Hippocratic Oath, the obligation to do no harm, and wondered whether what she was doing constituted harm or prevention of harm. If Petrov was passing classified information to the Soviets, then stopping him protected American interests and potentially American lives. But he was also her patient, someone who had trusted her with his medical care, and she was using that access to help build a case against him. The ethical calculations made her head hurt. Chen had acknowledged the complexity when she raised it during their meeting, but his response had been pragmatic. National security took precedence over individual privacy concerns, especially when the individual in question was actively engaged in espionage. Petrov was discharged on November 8th at 11:30 in the morning. Barbara was working that day, and she helped coordinate his discharge paperwork, explaining his medication schedule and follow-up appointment dates with the same professional courtesy she extended to every patient. The final medical forms he signed contained the most elaborate notations she'd seen. dense clusters of letter number combinations that filled 3 separate margins. She made copies for the FBI before the originals went into hospital archives. Petrov thanked her as he prepared to leave, shaking her hand and telling her she'd been very kind during his stay. His grip was firm, his eyes direct, and for a moment Barbara saw him not as a suspect or a source of coded messages, but as a human being who'd been sick and was now recovering. The moment passed quickly, but it stayed with her as she watched him walk toward the hospital exit where a nephew was supposedly waiting to drive him home. The FBI maintained surveillance on Petrov's apartment building, a modest structure in DuPont Circle with 12 units and a shared entrance. Chen provided Barbara with periodic updates, a courtesy he wasn't required to extend but did anyway, perhaps because he understood that she'd invested more than professional obligation in this case. On November 15th, Marina Sokolova visited Petrov's apartment. Technical surveillance equipment installed by FBI agents captured sounds consistent with a camera shutter and low conversation in Russian. The visit lasted 38 minutes. Analysis of Petrov's recent translation work revealed he'd been handling contracts for 3 different companies that worked with the Department of Defense. Nothing classified crossed his desk directly, but he had access to technical specifications, procurement timelines, and policy discussions that could help Soviet intelligence understand American defense priorities and capabilities. The codes in his medical charts weren't encoding specific classified documents. They were encoding summaries and assessments, condensed information that Sokolova could photograph and transmit back to Moscow through diplomatic channels. On November 18th, federal agents arrested Viktor Petrov at his apartment at 6:15 in the morning. The arrest warrant was based on evidence gathered through surveillance and the documentation Barbara had provided. Simultaneously, the State Department delivered a formal protest to the Soviet embassy regarding Sokolova's intelligence activities. She couldn't be arrested due to diplomatic immunity, but she was declared persona non grata and given 72 hours to leave the country. Seized from Petrov's apartment were a camera, encoded documents, cipher materials, and approximately $4,000 in cash that he could not adequately explain. Chen called Barbara at the hospital that afternoon to inform her that the operation had been successful and that her role had been critical to its outcome. He thanked her for her vigilance and her cooperation. Barbara sat in the break room after the call ended, staring at her hands and feeling nothing like what she'd expected to feel. There was no sense of triumph, no relief that a spy had been caught. There was only exhaustion and a growing awareness that her life was about to become very complicated in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The hospital administrator called her into his office on November 21st. The FBI had finally briefed hospital leadership on what had occurred, and the administrator's reaction was a mixture of pride and concern. Pride that a Georgetown nurse had demonstrated such professional awareness, concern about the patient privacy implications, and the potential media attention. Barbara assured him she'd followed all proper protocols and had consulted with the FBI before taking any action that might compromise patient care. The administrator nodded, but his expression suggested he was already thinking about how to manage the story if it became public. It became public 3 days later when her name appeared in the Washington Post. The Washington Post article appeared on November 24, 1983, below the fold on the front page with the headline, "Georgetown Nurse Aids FBI in Soviet Espionage Case." Barbara's name was in the second paragraph. The FBI had tried to keep her identity confidential, but someone involved in the case had spoken to a reporter, and once her name was out there, everything changed. Her phone started ringing before she'd finished reading the article. Reporters wanted interviews. Her mother called from Pennsylvania, confused and frightened, asking if Barbara was safe. Colleagues from the hospital left messages expressing support or concern or simply curiosity about details not included in the news coverage. Barbara stopped answering her phone on November 25th and let her machine collect messages she couldn't bring herself to return. She went to work on November 26th and felt the shift immediately. Some colleagues treated her like a hero, approaching her in the break room to say they were proud of her vigilance. Others kept their distance, and their discomfort was obvious in the way they avoided eye contact or cut conversations short. One nurse she'd worked with for 6 years asked her quietly whether she'd considered what this meant for patient trust, whether people would now worry that their nurses were watching them for reasons that had nothing to do with medical care. The question stayed with Barbara through her entire shift. She'd never thought of herself as conducting surveillance. She'd noticed something unusual and had reported it to the appropriate authorities. But she could see how it looked from the outside, how patients might now wonder whether their private medical information was truly private, whether the people caring for them were also evaluating them for other purposes. 3 patients that week requested different nurses when they learned Barbara would be assigned to their care. The requests went through proper channels and were framed as personal preferences, but Barbara knew what they meant. On December 6th, she received a subpoena to testify before a federal grand jury, considering espionage charges against Viktor Petrov. The hearing was scheduled for December 14th, and Barbara spent the intervening days reviewing her documentation and meeting with a federal prosecutor who prepared her for the kinds of questions she would face. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s named Ellen Richardson, and she was efficient and direct. She told Barbara that Petrov's defense attorney would likely argue that Barbara had violated patient privacy and had conducted an unauthorized investigation that poisoned any evidence derived from it. Richardson assured her that Barbara had acted properly and legally, but the warning made Barbara's stomach tighten with anxiety she couldn't shake. The grand jury hearing took place in a federal courthouse in downtown Washington. Barbara sat in a waiting room for 90 minutes before being called to testify, and when she finally entered the hearing room, she saw 19 faces watching her with expressions ranging from interest to skepticism. She answered questions for 43 minutes, describing how she'd noticed the notations, why they'd seemed suspicious, and what steps she'd taken before contacting the FBI. Petrov's defense attorney, a man named Robert Klein, who was present to observe the proceedings, asked whether she'd considered that the notations might be innocent, whether she'd discussed her concerns with Petrov directly, and whether she understood that patients had a reasonable expectation of privacy even in hospital settings. Barbara answered that she had considered alternative explanations, that approaching Petrov would have compromised any potential investigation if her suspicions were correct, and that she believed patient privacy ended when that privacy was being used to facilitate espionage. Klein's expression suggested he disagreed, but the grand jury voted to indict Petrov on 3 counts of espionage, and Barbara was dismissed. She walked out of the courthouse into cold December air and realized her hands were shaking. The stress manifested physically over the following weeks. Barbara stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night, lying awake with her mind cycling through the testimony and the questions and the faces of colleagues who'd grown distant. She lost 12 pounds between November and January, not through any deliberate effort, but because food held no appeal, and eating felt like a chore she couldn't muster energy for. Her mother drove down from Pennsylvania on January 7, 1984, took one look at Barbara's apartment and her daughter's appearance, and insisted they spend the day together. Over lunch, Barbara's mother asked whether the recognition and the commendation letter from the FBI was worth what it was costing her. Barbara didn't have an answer. Petrov's trial began on March 5, 1984, in federal district court. Barbara was called to testify on March 8th, and this time she had to face Petrov directly across the courtroom. He looked thinner than she remembered, older, and when their eyes met briefly, she saw something she couldn't quite identify. Anger, maybe, or resignation, or simply exhaustion. Klein cross-examined her for over an hour, returning repeatedly to themes of privacy and trust, suggesting that Barbara had transformed herself from caregiver to informant without proper authorization or oversight. The prosecutor objected multiple times, and the judge sustained most of the objections, but the implication hung in the courtroom air. The jury convicted Petrov on all counts on March 19th. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Barbara read about the sentencing in the newspaper while sitting in her apartment with the FBI commendation letter on her coffee table, beside clippings from the Post and the Times. She'd done what she believed was right. She'd reported suspicious activity to the proper authorities and had cooperated with a legitimate investigation. But sitting there alone, she wished someone had warned her that doing the right thing would cost so much, that it would change how people looked at her and how she looked at herself. She returned to work the next day because not working felt worse than working, but she knew she couldn't stay in cardiac care, couldn't keep walking past the room where Petrov had stayed and remembering everything that had followed from noticing those notations in the margins. Barbara transferred to the pediatric unit at Georgetown Hospital in May 1984, requesting a change that her supervisors approved without question. The cardiac care floor held too many complicated memories, and she needed distance from the place where everything had started. Pediatrics offered something closer to a fresh start. The children she cared for were too young to know about Soviet spies or grand jury testimony, and their parents were focused on their own crises in ways that left little room for questions about Barbara's past. She found some measure of peace in the work, though she recognized that the experience had marked her permanently in ways she was still discovering. The FBI contacted her again in 1986, asking if she would consult on training materials for medical professionals. The Bureau was developing protocols to help hospital staff identify suspicious activities without violating patient privacy or compromising care. Barbara agreed, partly because the work felt like an attempt to extract meaning from what she'd been through. She spent 6 months helping write guidelines and case studies, using her experience to illustrate the fine line between appropriate vigilance and inappropriate surveillance. The training materials were eventually distributed to hospitals near military installations and government facilities, and Barbara lectured at 3 nursing conferences in 1987 and 1988, always using a pseudonym to maintain what remained of her privacy. In August 1989, Barbara received a letter forwarded through FBI channels. The return address indicated it had come from the Federal Correctional Institution, where Viktor Petrov was serving his sentence. She stared at the envelope for 20 minutes before opening it. The letter was brief, written in careful English on standard prison stationery. Petrov acknowledged what he had done and stated that he was not writing to justify his actions or to ask for sympathy. He thanked her for being a professional nurse despite everything that had followed, and he expressed regret not for his ideology, but for betraying the trust of people who had provided him with genuine medical care when he needed it. The letter ended without requesting a response. Barbara kept the letter in a drawer in her kitchen and never answered it. Her feelings about Petrov remained complicated in ways she couldn't fully articulate. He had been both a genuine patient with a serious cardiac condition and an active intelligence operative using his hospitalization as cover for espionage. Both things were true simultaneously, and reconciling them required accepting a level of moral ambiguity she'd never encountered in nursing school. The Cold War ended in the years that followed. The Berlin Wall came down in November 1989, and the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991. Barbara watched these events on television news and wondered whether her small role had mattered in the larger context of geopolitical change. She concluded eventually that individual acts of vigilance had mattered, even if the outcome seemed inevitable in retrospect. Sokolova had returned to Russia after being expelled from the United States, and according to information Chen shared with Barbara during a chance encounter in 1992, Sokolova's career had apparently survived the exposure without significant damage. Intelligence work operated by different rules than ordinary life, and the consequences fell unevenly on those involved. Barbara met someone in 1993, a hospital administrator named David Chen, who understood her past without needing extensive explanation, and who didn't treat her story as either a source of fascination or discomfort. They married in October of that year in a small ceremony attended by family and a few close friends. Barbara continued nursing until her retirement in 2008, 35 years after she'd first started at Georgetown. She never fully escaped the story. Journalists contacted her periodically on Cold War anniversaries, and she gave interviews to a few of them, though she always insisted on approving any direct quotes before publication. In 2010, at age 58, Barbara participated in an oral history project documenting Cold War intelligence operations. The interviewer asked whether she would make the same choice if she could go back to September 1983, with the knowledge of everything that would follow. Barbara thought about the question for a long time before answering. She said she would do it again because the alternative, ignoring what she'd observed, would have been a different kind of betrayal. But she also said she understood now that doing the right thing didn't mean there was no cost, that choices had consequences that rippled forward in ways no one could predict, and that she'd paid for her vigilance with relationships and peace of mind and a sense of professional identity she'd spent years rebuilding. The medical records with Petrov's coded notations were preserved in FBI archives, declassified in part during the 1990s, as Cold War documents became available to researchers. Barbara's contribution appeared in several books about Soviet intelligence operations in Washington, usually as a footnote or a brief paragraph acknowledging that a nurse at Georgetown Hospital had identified suspicious activity. The brevity of those mentions seemed appropriate to Barbara. She hadn't been trying to become part of history. She'd simply noticed something unusual and had made a decision about what to do with that observation. The story of Barbara Henley and Viktor Petrov illustrates the complex calculations people make when faced with impossible choices, the tension between professional duty and civic responsibility, and the personal costs that come with both action and inaction. Barbara's vigilance mattered in the context of Cold War counterintelligence, and so did everything she gave up because of it. She lived with both truths for the rest of her life, and she made peace with them not by resolving the contradiction, but by accepting that some things remain complicated no matter how much time passes or how much perspective distance provides. The codes hidden in medical records were cracked, the spy was caught, and the nurse who noticed them learned that protecting national security sometimes meant sacrificing the quiet anonymity that had once defined her professional life. Whether that trade was worth making depended on which angle you viewed it from, and Barbara spent decades considering all of them.